subscribe. This week's episode was brought to you by the generous support of our listeners, Ronan Tucker and Dante Monroe. Getting the extended shows, bonus stickers, and access to our Discord coven is as easy as becoming a $5 subscriber at www.patreon.com/thewholerabbit, where we work tirelessly to find new rabbit holes and throw you down them. This week, we start putting some big pieces of the puzzle together concerning the practical anatomy of the occult psyche and how it was accurately expressed by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, with their best ideas left largely misunderstood and poorly represented by a culture too afraid to deal with its own shadows. We discuss what psychoanalysis has to do with demonology, exorcism, Silent Hill, and the great dragon of chaos we might call the libido. In the extended episode, we discuss sex, drugs, fetishes, and why people like calling each other daddy. We also go deep discussing the psychological mechanics that create the incel and ways that everybody can begin integrating their shadows with chaos magic, kinky sex, and video games. Thank you, and enjoy the show.
I fucking love that movie, man.
That was the last thing I did the first time I got stoned, is I went in my dorm room and I watched that movie, and I couldn't help but notice they're eating or drinking something in every scene, if not talking about food.
Quentin Tarantino is kind of crazy. Have you ever seen The Hateful Eight?
I have not. Does it pertain to the sub-personalities that you fall victim to in a group?
I don't know. I never thought of that. But it would be really cool if it did. Or if some parallel could be drawn between them.
Because no matter what you do, no matter how you divide the 8, there will always be the shadow. Hello everybody, and welcome to The Whole Rabbit, where we don't just feel ourselves becoming more and more relaxed by the sound of my voice, deeper and deeper as waves of uninhibited bliss roll over us, starting in our head, working slowly, gently, relaxingly, down your soft rabbit ears, into your beryllium-plated space helmet, down your spine, washing over your hydraulic canyon running legs and terminating in your enormous, fluffy feet, which are relaxing more and more as you listen to the sound of my voice, allowing ourselves to become very relaxed, releasing all tension and opening ourselves to the sound of my voice, which carries you on a wave of bliss directly into the warm ocean where all our emotions live, down in the warm womb of creation. You hardly notice the subtle rushing, muffling, churning of a Titanic slithering below, nor do you see the black spotlight shining on you from underneath, growing wider and darker still, but you feel it, tracking you from abyssal depths incalculable, wondering if its vastness has shrunken invisibly with the light inside its vacuous mouth, and the blackness had become its belly, because today we're discussing the shadow and how to integrate it before shadow integrate you. I am joined by Mari Sampson, the crypto canine queen.
Oh,
and the dastardly Darth Dingus.
That was really weird, dog.
No, I didn't. ASMR, like, hypnosis, like, session. About to go under, man.
So why are we talking about the shadow and how to integrate it? It seems like it's important.
The shadow exacerbates or is the source of many modern maladies like depression, incels, toxic positivity, the satanic panic, the Project MK Ultra. It was obviously like an experiment in psychological conditioning. No-Fap, political correctness, it was real. Cancel culture, alt-right politics, and of course Silent Hill, but also the hero's journey.
Because everything is the hero's journey if you've read enough Campbell or Jung.
I went to the grocery store today, does that count?
So society has some problems.
We live in a society!
And it's got problems. It's got issues people are not taking care of on a personal level, and it's creating problems on a macroscopic level. We've discussed it from a metaphysical level using occult symbolism, but we haven't really circled around to it and discussed it in psychological terms, which is like the de facto way of talking about shit like this. And I think this topic is kind of meta because modern minds understand libido pretty well. I think as a general tendency, they get it, but they avoid sincere examination into it as a concept because it is so offensive to the modern ego, which is pretty much exactly how Freud described it. You would essentially rather pull your eyes out than seeing the truth.
Well, it's also, I mean, on the subject of its relationship to the libido, the shadow could be described as essentially an amalgam or a homunculus of all of the needs and deep desires that you have that make you that you repress for fear that they would be socially unacceptable or for the punishments that you may have received for having them as a child.
And that's your ego's job. A healthy ego is supposed to...
It's supposed to mediate between your separate parts. Your superego, your shadow, or to be purely Jungian, the anima, the anima, animus, and the anima, and the other shit.
It's supposed to compartmentalize, and it's supposed to occlude you knowing yourself. It's stopping you from identifying with the most extreme parts of your personality. Whenever you hear about Freud, and I got really upset about this early in the week, I could tell Mari was nervous about this episode because she's like, Luke is just going to yell at me no matter what I say. And no, I don't want to just yell at Mari. I want to yell at everybody because I went to college once upon a time and I got talked out of taking psychology and I took something even less substantial. It was communications. I think people thought it was computers, but it really wasn't. Anyway, I eventually went back into psychology and then I realized why everyone talked me out of it. They sort of do this thing where they're like, okay, it's psychology time, serious adult psychology time. Now, here's the thing. There's this guy named Freud, right? And even though he was wrong about everything, we have to tell you about him and test you on him and take you through all of his theories.
That's pretty much how I learned it too.
And then they tell you about Freud and they're like, he had this student named, we won't talk about him. Let's move on to B.F. Skinner. And like they completely skipped over Carl Jung, I think because he was into tarot cards.
Yeah, pretty much. I had to read about that on my own or in like some kind of like English or writing class.
Yeah, I actually heard about Freud in high school, but there was not one mention of Jung.
Yep.
Not even in like English class when they were talking about Joseph Campbell.
All of the scientific psychology, like therapies and theories and whatnot, are all based on Freud. All of them. Like if you were to go get a job as a psychologist or a psychiatrist, that's the theory that you learn.
Even if they're pretending that it's not, maybe?
They change the words around and stuff so that you don't, but it's exactly the same. I took developmental psychology as well. That was like my highest level psychology, and it was all Freud. Like the whole class was Freud.
I'd say that the biggest contribution that Freud had is his process. Freud was the first person to really develop a process to analyzing and breaking people down and trying to understand what makes them tick.
Yes.
And he did it effectively enough for us to build a foundation and a methodology around that supposedly works, even though if you look at the articles for the last decade, it's been out in the open that there's an epidemic of mental disease even amongst the elite class because it's just not working, whatever these psychologists are doing.
I really feel like there's something lacking from the theory. This is my personal opinion. And this is why I studied Carl Jung on my own. He was often made fun of by the other psychiatrists and psychologists of the time because he would take into account cultures and mythos and the religion or the beliefs of the person that he was psychoanalyzing. Also, when he did dream work, it was a lot more like there was a lot more flexibility and nuance to the way that he read his patients. And I personally appreciate that. There is a reason that if you put a human alone or human groups alone somewhere without context of anything, pretty much 100% of the time they'll start up a religion on their own or some kind of like mythology or whatever. Like it just happens.
And they'll each fall into individual group roles, archetypal ones.
Right, but all of that stuff and the hero's journey and all of these things that you think, oh, that's just a storybook. That has no place in the medical field of psychology. It's like, actually, it certainly does, because that is the environmental contribution to our development as human beings and as individual minds. And we'll get to talking about this later, but a lot of people get stuck in certain stages of development, depending on either what happened to them or what they're fixated on. Even though you're an adult person or even a grandpa or a grandma, you could have the developmental mental age of, say, a 13-year-old. You know
And
what
we
I mean?
understand that. I used to work with mentally disabled adults who still had the power of contract over themselves and lived independently, but we had an estimated mental age for these people, and it wasn't because we disliked them or we were somehow like judging them. It was because you had to understand, okay, this person has the emotional bandwidth of, like, let's say an 8-year-old, and you shouldn't
Yeah.
like provoke them like in the same way you wouldn't like an 8-year-old. You know what I mean? Like, there's a certain level of approach that you take. And I guess this is my big contention, is that it's a bit meta to see how everyone kind of gets the idea of libido, but they patently reject Freud's ideas consciously. They're like, well, I don't want to fuck my mom, so I guess that means Freud is wrong. Or they're like, well, there's such thing as asexual people, so I guess Freud is wrong. But like, and then take anyone, for example, gets the idea of grooming, and grooming really wouldn't work unless libido worked more or less the way Freud and Jung described it.
Yeah. 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 I'm seeing now what he actually means by it is the word affection was used. And that makes sense because now that we have neurological studies, brain chemistry, we know all this stuff now, right? Oxytocin is the love snuggle chemical, right, that you get from your mother. It's when you make contact, and it helps develop your brain, and it helps make you a person, a whole person. And we actually need that to survive. So yes, but what you're talking about, libido, actually it is it's a chemical that we need to survive and to grow as human beings.
They
And spiritually.
probably tell you to just like cool it because they're going to come back and explain it through chemistry later, right? Because that seems to be the modality now. It's all biological and pills and whatever. And this is something that came up all the way back in the 70s in Vallis when Philip K. Dick was explaining his experiences at Orange County Mental Facility when he met Dr. Stone, or as we conceived, the philosopher Stone, who by coming into contact with him was purified back into his solar ego, or his pure will. And the way this was achieved was by Stone identifying the wound and extracting what Philip K. Dick would call the bullet, right? And finding the bullet, which can be really hard to find. And that's a medical thing where oftentimes people get shot, they don't even know it. And then when they do get shot, they'll go in for surgery. Sometimes they don't find the bullet, right? And of course, this can cause problems. People can live their whole life with a bullet, but psychologically speaking, it's this idea that if you don't get the bullet out, you can treat the symptoms, you can sew the person back together. But if you don't get that bullet, they're never going to heal. And this is the idea. This is like the core principle of psychoanalysis, is you're digging for the bullet. And Philip K. Dick is basically saying that people just stopped looking for it. They gave up. They started treating the symptoms.
Yes, and I agree with that. Part of the reason I stopped going to get, I used to be on a lot of anxiety and depression medication and all this. I ended up getting off of it, but it was because my psychiatrist would listen to me for 10 minutes about any symptoms I had and would dismiss me, and it would cost like $150 for 15 minutes of her time. And then she would give me these pills that made me feel really weird, and didn't make me feel better. They made me feel like zombies, or like a puppet zombies, or something that was like, I was happy doing everything, and like I wasn't sad per se, but I also wasn't happy per se. Like I was kind of in the middle, but it was so unfulfilling for me. And as an artist, part of what fuels me is the emotional spikes of experience like that. Like even suffering and like trauma and bad things can give you like a really good creative energy if you know how to utilize it. I got off of that when I realized they were treating symptoms. And actually the best therapy I've ever had is therapy with group therapy, or I guess a psychologist. It's the one that does talk therapy.
The psychologist would be closer to what you might call a psychoanalyst.
Yeah. Yes.
Where you talk to them and they break down the things that you say
and they talk you back out of it. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. That talk therapy, but that by itself didn't help me as much as like group therapy. Like just for me, going and doing social things actually helps a lot. So, I found lots of ways to help with those things, and I don't want to be on drugs because they really kind of turn off my personality.
This forms what we would call the crux of shadow work, is doing the things, whatever is necessary for you, because it's going to be different for everybody, to liberate yourself from the influence of your unconscious and repressed desires and anxieties. That would be the bullet, or the results of the bullet.
And unlike everything else in psychology, this thing doesn't seem so culturally bound. This is something that happens across race, religion, location, culture, creed. This concept of the shadow and piercing the subconscious with the solar will or ego, and creating a ground to build your life on from that. Because until you confront your shadow, you might not be able to interact with other people. You might not be able to have normal relationships. And so it's explained how it is with plants or animals, where we have these different tendencies within us that, depending on how you balance them, can produce a fuller result. And it's argued that this idea is just not applied to humans, whereas we apply it to like corn, we apply it to like horses. Like back in the Egyptian days, horses were like up to your waist. You needed 2 of them just to pull a friggin' chariot.
It's really funny.
They were tiny horses. So like we've known about that.
Sled dogs. So the interesting thing about the shadow now is the fact that it's incredibly difficult. It's actually impossible to directly observe, and you can only really witness its consequences. The shadow's desires are repressed. They're not acknowledged. So it's a part of you that has to get its needs through underhanded means. You will develop these behaviors that indirectly satisfy whatever neuroses that you're hiding. Say you have a desire to be liked and accepted. You can't acknowledge that, due to, honestly, this is a personal problem of mine, is like a desire to fit into social groups and be accepted. But I feel that I can't do that for a variety of reasons that I haven't quite explained. And this can lead to me not expressing myself.
And
yeah,
so
mine does that too.
And so shadow work would be you coming to contact with those things that make you feel like you can't interact with others, facing them.
Or powerless, or make you feel powerless, or make you feel like you can't do something and you confront it.
Yeah. The shadow may just be trying to protect itself from being harmed.
But you're not getting rid of it. You're not like getting rid of it or canceling it out or numbing it. That's not the idea.
You're walking over to it and shining a flashlight on it. And then it's like
the other day I feel that I had maybe the best example I could possibly give for an encounter with the shadow, in which I was attempting a series of behaviors to try and drag it out, researching for this podcast, getting something to bubble up to the surface. And in order to do something, I needed to drop my my weed vape, and I have a fairly obvious drug problem. And it took me 5 minutes of just standing next to my couch with my left arm limp, just holding this thing just to drop it, so I would stop smoking it and start doing my research. There was a feeling of physical resistance. That's what I would consider a close encounter with the shadow.
And this brings up the idea of subpersonalities, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. It's so the concept of a subpersonality is that at no point in time are you ever like really one set of traits. Anytime you talk about something that you would define yourself as, it's a little bit untrue, because there's going to be a part of you that contradicts your claim, but you won't be aware of it in that moment.
Or maybe you don't want other people to be aware of it, so you try to hide it or not show it.
I mean, let me ask you, dear listener, are you the same person in the privacy of your bedroom as you are, at a concert or just
School.
Any kind of public gathering, school, work?
Or at a wedding, recital, dinner?
Do you even have the same opinions? Like your environment can influence any number of things about you at any given point in time. The concept of I or myself or yourself is really just bound to a point in time, and it changes constantly.
And so will your shadow, actually.
Yeah, shadow work is never over. You have to. It's a constant. It's a constant
dance.
developing. It's a cat and mouse. Yeah,
It's a dance.
So you
Beautiful.
might be aware of your various different selves over time, you start to reduce those and you become, more singular. And part of the idea of chaos magic is to purposefully grow those different sub-personalities, but of course have them integrated. I think some people just don't give a shit. My point is the shadow is the one personality, though, is the one sub-personality that you really don't want to identify with ever. And so it's very elusive in that way. But the closer you get to it, or like whenever you run up to an emotional disturbance, because you can't identify with it, you tend to see it when other people engage with that quality or that personality or that characteristic, and it feels like amplified. And so
it freaks you out. Like you'll get triggered when something happens. Like, okay, say you're dating someone and you're cheating on them, or like maybe you fucked up and you cheated on them once and you feel like super guilty about it and you want to tell them and you don't know what to do. And then like you see a show or a movie with them and the main character cheats on his wife or something in the movie. And then the guy is like, he gets like triggered about it because his shadow is like tapping him on the shoulder like, hey buddy, remember that thing we did together? Like
she probably did it too.
Like, no, I can't tell her. I can't act like I know anything. No, I can't act weird. Oh no, what do I do? Like, that's the whole thing that the shadow is trying to get you to react.
The shadow can be many different things, including the cause of your behaviors and your persecutor for them at the same time.
But often it drives you to persecute yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really do anything except antagonize you to the point where you become destructive, to where you ruin your own life, because you actually have to come clean at some point. You know what I'm saying? It's up to you how far you're going to drive it, or how far you're going to let your shadow fester until you actually pay attention. All it really wants is for you to pay attention to it and to kind of pay it homage and then be truthful.
But all your ego wants to do is not pay attention to it.
Right, because it's trying to save face. So, but they both kind of work together, in my opinion. I think the ego and the shadow work together because wherever the ego is, the shadow can't be. So as long as you're holding on to your ego and the ego avoid each other, they're like people, they're like ex-lovers, and they're like, oh fuck, they're going to that club, I'm not going to that club. So if you're hanging out with one, you're not hanging out with the other one. So you have to leave one to go to the other one.
This also honestly reminds me of a kind of a biological concept where each of the cells in your body are individually living things, and they each want to survive. And the same thing can happen with something as abstract as your very self. Your ego, your shadow, depending on how fractured you are and how much dissonance your subpersonalities cause for you at any given amount of time, each of these individual parts can be so conflicted that they start trying to destroy each other.
Yes, they'll fight. Like aspects fight against each other, and while they're fighting in your head, you'll become sick, or you'll have some kind of like fight with someone else. You'll start projecting onto other people. You'll start doing escapism behavior, like trying to avoid responsibility. If you have your subpersonalities are in conflict, or if you have cognitive dissonance where you act like you believe one thing but inside you don't believe that, you're going to have a breakdown at some point. It's just a matter of time. You
will. Like, each of these influences within you are going to build tension, and that must be released or it'll snap.
One way or another. And you can find outlets. Like, if you really don't want to express a behavior, yeah, sure. But, like one time I felt the need to like key someone's car that like had wronged me. Like, I just wanted to fuck their car up. And I was right there. No one was there. It was nighttime. And I was like, oh yeah. Had my hand out with the key. I was like walking past the side of the car with it like an inch next to the car. And
you couldn't do it.
No, I couldn't do it. No, I literally had to hold my hand back with the other hand to not do it. It was a struggle, dude. And I was like, no, it's not the right thing to do. If I came back to my car and it was messed up because somebody didn't, somebody didn't like that I was friends with somebody, like stupid drama bullshit, like I would hate that. So I'm not going to do it to somebody else. So actually keeping my shadow side from coming out and doing what I wanted to do, it was literally a physical struggle.
And in this, there's something important too, because no individual is always going to succeed in that. I remember 3 years ago, I had a lot of guilt, and I still do because this was the last contact that I've ever had with this particular family member of mine before he died. I was staying at his house, and one of our, a relative of mine, experienced or stayed through hospice care there, and eventually died in the room that I was sleeping in. And so I knew there was some good shit in that bottom drawer, and I couldn't resist the opportunity to take all of it. And that's something that, at some point in your life, if you're at all an honest person, you have done something so horrible that it makes you a little bit sick. And a major goal of shadow work is reconciling this, the differences you have with yourself, the guilt and the shame for doing something wrong.
Yeah.
It's the bad, even the bad things are a part of you, and nobody can be good all the time. And in that way, it's good to fuck up a little bit every now and then.
And honestly, I think the most basic and rudimentary tool that everybody uses to integrate their own shadow, and this also comes with a grain of salt and some time on the wound. Let me put it that way. If you did something wrong and you're embarrassed about it, the fact that, like, have you ever talked to like an older person that they tell you a story about how they messed up when they were younger or something? And they're laughing and carrying on. It's like, I was such an idiot. And they make such a joke out of it, of like, don't be a dumbass like me, and they actually, after a while, you can laugh at yourself. And then when you're freely allowed to admit and tell others about what you did, you can tell the truth out loud and not care about what other people think of you. Comedy is a great way to get over your shadow and to get over the things that haunt you and that cause you grief and pain and illness in some cases.
And that's important because this is a fact that, as human beings, we all know, but what's done is done. And sometimes you have to reconcile with that. Like, you can't just dwell on it forever,
Yeah, it's unhealthy.
We're not always in touch with this fact in the way that we should be. And that's a shadow manifestation as well, is trying to, what I'll succinctly put is achieve the impossible, living in a world of illusion. And it'll keep you distracted from confronting whatever it is that's bothering you.
Many distractions, yeah.
Well, you mentioned that these psychological pathologies can create physical pathologies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so.
They can do it one way or another too. Like, it can be either a psychosomatic thing where just the stress of existing with yourself is starting to drag your health down.
Like, my sister has bipolar disorder, and when she gets super, super anxious and stressed out, and like, you've been frazzled to the point where you're about to have a nervous breakdown. She got the shingles, which she's already had the chicken pox when she was a kid. The virus reactivated because her immune system got so weak from the stress. So yes, you can, if you have worries and you have problems, like managing your guilt or your shame, like if you can't manage those emotions very well, yeah, you're absolutely going to have some kind of illness manifest.
And there are other ways that this can manifest too. There's also the classic self-harm, which I'm very much, I won't say guilty of, but, guilty
I know
of.
a lot about it. My roommate actually has a lot of experience with that. So the psychology, huh?
I just wanted to bring up the fact that that I have actually numbed the sciatic nerve on my right leg from hitting it so much.
Like, do you punch it?
Yeah, that was my classic thing. That's another way that the shadow can damage your physical body. Maybe you don't eat enough. You neglect yourself. You don't shower, don't brush your teeth, and over time, those things wear down. Yeah,
it could be with anything, because from what I understand, when I was speaking with my roommate, she let me know that I already know this. It's pretty obvious because both her arms are covered in scars. She used to cut her arms and her legs all the time to basically avoid confronting people in high emotional states. So she would use it as a way to kind of trance out and have a kind of a catharsis to deal with the negative emotions. And then in order to stifle her own negative emotions, or like if she wanted to cry or felt bad or didn't feel like going to school, she would do it as a way to keep herself grounded. And she explained it to me like it's a ritual. And then also then there were some other issues like with if she couldn't do that, like if people caught on to her doing that, she would have anorexia symptoms. Eating disorders, I believe, are another form of self-harm. I used to be a binge eater. I mean, I still kind of binge eat on occasion, depending on how good the food is. But I don't nearly have this like it was this like parasitic association with food that I had, where I had to have it and I had to have this much and lots of it, you know, and that's gone from me now. But I used to have this binge eating thing too. But she used to starve herself if she couldn't cut herself. But that was a way for her to like maybe your grumbling stomach could remind you that hey, here you are on planet Earth and you have to deal with this person now and you have to smile and you can't show them your shadow side or like what you're feeling or what you don't want to confront that right now. So it's a distraction. It's definitely escapism.
I can definitely attest that nothing quite gets you out of your own body and out of your normal
Right.
state of mind like not eating food for a long time.
Oh yeah. And I believe she used laxatives as well.
Oh,
So there was a combination of both, which was, I mean, you're like walking around like a zombie at that point. So you're so it's like you can't deal
you
with
are
the emotions
so
or you don't want to confront the shadow of like how you feel about a situation. You need to get by. It's a survival response to just get by. So you try to numb your body in any way you can.
honestly, now that you bring it up, I can really see that because there were times when I was living with my mother in Texas that I just wouldn't eat for like a week. Specifically the statement of walking around like a zombie really got to me because it's not just like the dissociation from your body and the mental changes. Because fun fact, the Inuits who live where there are no psychoactive, there's no method of getting a psychoactive substance, will starve themselves to get high.
Yeah.
It's that and just like the lack of energy from not having eaten
It just
really
makes
does
you feel
kind of
okay.
dull you out.
It makes you feel okay. Like I was
Yeah.
telling you earlier about how the psychiatric medications made me feel okay. You know, not good, even okay. Like,
I've been,
what does that even mean? Like, do you want to feel that way? So
I
also
think I understand.
she explained to me that also having the pain in the day, like when you're walking around, like you know how if anybody who has ADHD or ADD or who's obsessive compulsive or gets stuck in thought loops,
Oh, that's me.
yeah,
Me.
if you're hyperactive in the head and you're always off in your own world and you're daydreaming and stuff,
Oh, that's me.
a lot of
Mhm.
this masochism, this against yourself, like hurting yourself, is a way to remind yourself, hey, you're in the real world. You know,
Yeah.
it's a grounding ritual. I mean, she says it's basically like a ritual that you would do when you had nothing else to help
Well,
you.
there's definitely a sense of being alive and a little bit of an exhilaration that comes with unpleasantness.
Yeah, and she said that like a lot of times you're so numb that you do that to feel alive. Because she said it's like you get a flood of endorphins when you're bleeding, right? It also happens when you exercise and you bust up your muscle fibers. Anytime you get hurt, you get like a flow of endorphins so that you don't pass out from pain.
Yeah.
So she's highly sensitive to those, and I think that's why she gravitated toward it so much.
And I think in that statement about the rush of endorphins is actually another interesting metaphor for the process of quote unquote confronting the shadow. To confront the shadow isn't really the best practical way to describe this process, but it's the endorphins in your body essentially control how much pain you feel at one time, and of course opiates are essentially recreational endorphins.
Yeah.
All opiates operate on endorphin receptors. They are your body's natural painkiller.
She
Um,
also has problems with those, so that's to note. If you're wired to have problems with those, then that might be some way that you cope.
yeah, that shit I got out of that drawer was really good.
Now, okay, so a
Wait,
healthy manifestation of integrating the shadow is you're self-harming yourself all the time, and maybe you need that, and so you redirect it towards exercise because you technically are self-harming yourself. They say that people that are like hooked on cocaine, oftentimes once they kick the habit, they end up being very obsessive weightlifters, for instance, because they need
Yeah.
that level of intensity. But that's actually a good thing.
And it left me puzzled at first when you brought up that story, because to speak sincerely of it, I think we intuitively understand there's some hidden wisdom even in what she was doing without being too specific.
I feel like it's an unconscious, systematic, and almost instinctual response. Basically, you're burnt out with stress, and it's an emergency response from your system.
For me, I would get into such emotionally intense states that it was the only way that I could even imagine expressing myself. There was nobody that I could really talk to, and I couldn't really put the things that I was experiencing into words.
Right,
So
so
the
that would
outlet
be
for rage was.
So
It's
let
a-
me explain
it's a lack
myself.
thing or outward, like you don't have an outlet. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, okay, so like how you said an outlet. At least you have some outlet. I'm not saying you should do anything like that, especially because we're speaking to the public. You definitely should seek help and not do that. But theoretically speaking, pleasure and pain are linked in some way, and we mentioned that you can get a flood of endorphins either from harming yourself by cutting yourself, or just by going to the gym or eating spicy food. That's a healthier way to deal with that same impulse. Or if you like to get into fights, maybe you could have your friend just come over and slap you. You have some sort of a controlled way to deal with it. And
an interesting, albeit obscure, reference to this is actually in the tarot. Not many people know that the Nine of Swords is also associated with laughter. Maybe the mad and twisted kind, but laughter nonetheless.
I was going to say, sometimes you have to laugh at some stuff that scares you to get over it. Like sometimes you don't necessarily have to harm yourself. Sometimes you can just laugh at it too.
Or cry at it.
You have to get you have to get it out. You know what I mean? Like I was saying, an outlet.
And also, as it pertains to shadow work, I would also encourage anybody listening, if they find one or the other difficult, go to whatever means are necessary to express whichever emotion is difficult for you.
Or dip your toes in. Do it a little bit at a time. Like
for me,
for me, I have a hard time saying no and setting boundaries for other people. So at first, one of the exercises, and this is actually recommended in actual psychology theories on therapy, and it's just you sit around by yourself and you practice saying no. You just say no. That actually helped me a lot. And it's really strange how I'm afraid to say no to so many people, but just doing it by myself is a baby step to where, like, now I tell people no all the time. I don't feel like it.
But the habit of not saying no eventually becomes a neurological, like an actual physical structure in your neurology.
Yeah, so you have to undo it by yourself in a closet if need be, practice on your own, and confront your shadow by do something that squeaks you out or makes you feel uncomfortable.
For me, the only way that I can cry at all is to play fucking Silent Hill 2.
No.
Okay.
Serious.
This brings me back to where I wanted to bring it, because I think the reason that you might inflict pain on yourself or bring yourself into situations that bring you pain are because ultimately, to deal with the shadow, it is so painful and so onerous a task that your pain threshold either must be very high, or you must have a way of alchemizing pleasure and pain into each other.
Coping.
Or you just have to be ready for it. Because one externalized instance of all the things we're talking about in fiction that keeps popping up into my head is Fight Club. Because in real life, you have two dudes who get into a fight. Now, these are wise dudes, but they're still getting into a fight. So what do? Instead of creating a bar fight and just swinging at each other with glass and killing one another, potentially hurting many innocent people that are intoxicated and trying to have a good time and get laid, what do? They go outside. They take off their ring. Maybe they even take off their shoes. And in this moment, their wisdom is kicking in and they're saying, I'm going to deal with this pain in a controlled way, number one. And number two, I am fighting myself. That's why I ultimately don't want to hurt this other person, and why we're going to give each other that, at least that mutual respect. And we see this exaggerated, of course, in Fight Club, because spoilers, if you haven't seen Fight Club, oh well. He's self-injuring himself, the narrator of the story, and it attracts
attracts other men to face their pain through the ritual of fighting, which, because we all know that after a bar fight, the two dudes are friends. They realize that ultimately they're not mad at each other, and they never were.
It's important to realize that you cannot confront the shadow directly or by force. There's no real way to assault the shadow. You have to be clever. You have to trick it. This is why, like in Fight Club, he made a whole ass other person.
In psychoanalytic theory, that's called resistance. And the closer you get to the thing that is causing the trauma, the closer and closer that person gets to reaching a point where they shut off entirely and will not be able to remember what it is. And formerly, they found a way beyond those barriers through hypnotism, but Freud found a better way through free association and discussion. But it's like what you said, you had to be tricky about it. You couldn't just run in the front door. You can't just, if you piss off Tony Soprano, he might not just storm out of your office and never talk to you again. He might kill you. So that's how severe resistance can be and why you have to approach it from the back.
Well,
Gabagool, over here.
From the back.
From the back.
So Freud obviously started all of the psychology movement, but he had lots of colleagues that helped branch it out. Rorschach. Who is that in relation to Freud? Because the Rorschach test is a great way to get at your deepest, innermost, subconscious shadows and other stuff.
I love the Rorschach test.
Me too. It's really fun. As an artist, I love looking at shapes, but a lot of time, if a shape is sharp or imposing, or it's if there's a lot of ink on the paper and it's very, very dark, people will say things out of their shadow persona, like they'll cite totems of their shadow that they see in it, and you can see like the things that look more evil, they'll say something that they think looks evil. Or like, yeah.
Well, this is something that is hard to explain verbally, but we understand at a level where kids can laugh at it, because you do this bit where it's like you show the Rorschach test, like, oh, I see an apple, I see a butterfly, and then the other kid's like, I see murder and knives, and I see.
I just like hit with an axe. I see a fucking a dying moth. I see. It's like
waiting for like the first guy to tell a dick joke in a group.
I see a dicks.
Dicks.
Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and well, sometimes it's a big brown dick.
I like all of those things. And it doesn't have to be brown.
Yeah, that was you actually.
That was George Carlin.
Freudian thing going on there.
That was George Carlin, and I'm fairly certain that at that time the finest cigars were brown in color, and probably from Cuba.
Oh my God! Yeah, I've smoked a Cuban cigar. It is delicious.
Can you blame these
longer for not smoking?
I went to a cigar bar in New Orleans where you could sit in there, have a drink of whiskey, and there's humidors everywhere. You can walk around, look at cigars, but you can also watch the dudes roll giant ass dried leaves of tobacco. Like
that's really cool.
It's a rolling bar. Like they roll fresh cigars straight in front of you. You could smoke cigars there and watch the game and drink. Oh my God, it was so cool. But
just don't let them roll your pasta.
I love all phallic symbols. They're all great.
But yeah, I don't know about y'all, but I have always wanted to get a fucking Rorschach test.
Me too. Actually, I've done one before.
So what did you learn about yourself?
That I was a victim of abuse.
That's not funny at all.
Well, actually, the psychologist
I thought it kind of was. I'm sorry.
Interviewing me learned that, but you know.
I'm sorry. It's not because it happened. It's just because the mood just dropped. Yeah, that sucks though. Sorry.
There's a lot of stuff that I'm not sure if I could talk about on this, but I'll try to insert it when it's relevant.
Well, I had to take such a ridiculously psychoactive amount of what is even now ridiculously high quality marijuana when my tolerance was exceedingly small to realize that I was being abused and that I was in a cult, because my ego was like, nah, I can't. Because like you get kind of committed at some point. You're like, man, I've been telling my friends about this. It's like, maybe I'm just gonna go to India and just you know what I mean? Like on some
See?
level, you just could, but no, like what? But because I had gotten so far out of my ego, I was like, no, no, no.
Okay.
I was able to see what it was, and so
THC is a mild hallucinogen. So you actually probably disassociated and you were able to examine the situation from an outside perspective in a way that didn't, like, you went around that block that we were just talking about. The resistance. You actually, by smoking that high amount of weed, you were able to disassociate and go around that block. And why do you think it's illegal? You know, why do you think it's illegal in so many places? Is because they don't want you to. Your traumas actually feed capitalism in certain ways. So they don't want you to heal in certain aspects. I think that's interesting that you had to get super high to actually identify that you were being attacked or that your boundaries are being violated, because normally you're programmed to be like, oh, that seems cool.
that's good for me.
Yeah, that seems legit.
Rabbit, I just want to point out your terror sounds like Jerry Seinfeld.
Bow, but down, bow, bow.
Boop, ba-doop, doop, boop, boop.
Do-do-do-do.
The movies we watch are a bit like Rorschach tests in that, now take for instance, why does Pinhead like pain so much? Maybe it's because he realizes that at the limits of pain is where you find your truest pleasure and freedom.
Some shit like
I
that.
can really relate to this on like a lot of levels, because it's something that I've actually only realized recently through engaging with shadow work. By the way, I have no idea what I've been doing specifically to drag this up, except for attempting to make myself uncomfortable.
Good job,
But
buddy. You're
all
in front of your
throughout-
shadow.
Yes.
You can also distract yourself by doing that as well. That was one of the problems with Freud's theory, where Jung came in and corrected him, not so much and he desexualized the libido, in so much as Freud was always trying to find the trauma in childhood, but Jung believed that the trauma was active now, and that by going and searching for the wound way back in the past, you were actually distracting yourself from finding the truth, and that you weren't, it's not that you never developed to a certain level, it's that once you face a certain amount of resistance, you begin to regress. And I guess that was their big falling out. That was a major part of it. And so it is a tricky methodology. How do you suss out and get to the exact wound itself? It's almost like a science. And so you have to be like, how do you move towards something that you are repulsed by? Is that how you know? It's like you do the George Costanza, you're like, I don't want to do it, so I'm going to do it.
Both of them use hypnosis actually actively in their practice, and it does work. There's a hypnosis therapy. It's like a regressive type of therapy. You could probably we could look this up and voice it over, but but you basically get hypnotized and you go back in time or whatever, like you did in the intro. Your body, your paws are relaxed and whatever, all that bullshit. And then you go back in time.
Thank you,
And
Mari.
you're supposed to imagine, oh, it was so good. I almost went out. I like almost went under. I'm susceptible to hypnosis. If you get relaxed enough, you can be. But anyway, if you go under and you go back to the most traumatic event, and it doesn't, like, Freud is kind of right, because most of the time it does happen when you're very young, because it's the first impression that you have or the first imprint of that. And it doesn't have to be a trauma. It could be something that you just remember because it was so profound or something. You know, it could be any kind of imprint when you're young. And usually it is when you're a child, but you can be traumatized when you're older. So Jung was right about that. And they're right to look more into it and desexualize it. But I think they're both right, because, like, it's really your environment that continues to change your psyche as you live. And now that we've learned in the modern age, we've learned that the brain is plastic. Like, we used to think neuroplasticity, which means the amount or the ability for your brain to actually change and regrow neurological cells. We thought that you couldn't do that after about the age of 21, but it turns out that we're always doing that. So Jung was right in that the trauma is existing now, because to me, if I have a phobia of something because of something that happened to me when I was young, or if I have a phobia of certain, or if I have PTSD of somebody that looks like the person that assaulted me, then that's a recent trauma. But the fact that your behavior is modified subconsciously because of that trauma, yes, that means the trauma exists now, but it also exists in the past, like Freud said, when it occurred.
As long as you're hung up on something like, or as long as you're traumatized by something, you will subconsciously adapt to survive it.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
Stuck in your brain. The signal still fires.
So are you confronting that signal, or are you avoiding it? Because the only way to undo that, it's a negative signal in your brain. Like sometimes people get traumatized to the point, like me, I was so antisocial because I don't trust people. It's like you get to the point where, but like I was saying earlier in the show, a part of my therapy is to confront people. Like I'll go to a small party with like 10 or 15 people. And like the first time I danced in a rave and was confident and like didn't care about what people thought about looking at me, like that's therapy. You can do it in like different ways. But the point is you go towards something that makes you uncomfortable.
You know what makes a lot of people uncomfortable?
You see today how, despite having all the money in the world, all these rich people can't seem to get any help for their problems because it's just not effective enough. Back in the olden days, when it was these experts who came up with this stuff, part of the problem is they kept finding all this sexual dysfunction with these rich families. And oftentimes they, how do you say this? They underestimated how prolific child abuse was amongst this class. And when it comes to children, it always gets controversial and it gets into really murky territory because they discovered that if you're honest with yourself and you remember what it was like being a kid, kids do have an interior sexual life and an interior fantasy world, but it's not the same thing as an adult fantasy world or an adult sexuality. The problem with Freud is that when people are like, I don't want to fuck my mom, I don't want to fuck my dad, it's like, no, you don't, because your ego prevents you from that. But your ego is doing that for survival reasons, in the same way that you learned pleasure and satisfaction and comfort from your parents first. And so you are likely to attach your libido to that object. But because you don't have a mature sexuality yet, it doesn't mean that it's disconnected. It grows on top of those old layers. And so on top of each layer, it's like your consciousness like breaks through a new barrier and it like forgets the old stuff. This is the thing, is like Jules eventually comes around to understanding that he's really only ever given a foot massage to women, because on some level, even when he's talking about his mom, and they don't loop back to this in that conversation, there is something sensual about the foot massage. And Vince even, he reminds him, it's like, it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing as sticking your tongue in the holiest of holies, but it does mean something. And that's the same thing where you know when someone is being a little too creepy with your kid, even though it's not overtly sexual. And it's because sexuality builds on top of something else. Like our personalities are built on top of these older survival mechanisms that for our own sake cannot reach the conscious level.
For anybody who isn't in the know as to why this man just started talking about fucking foot massages out of nowhere, it's about the movie Pulp Fiction. You just said Jules.
Yeah, it's from Pulp Fiction. I think it's summed up the entire, like...
We were talking about Fight Club earlier, so for the viewers, that's from Pulp Fiction, which is, isn't it the same director?
No.
No, it's not. Yeah.
Are they the same actors?
No.
No.
Pulp Fiction's way better, though.
Pulp Fiction's like one of my favorite movies. And you will know my name is the Lord
when I eat carrots and shoot lasers.